If you ever ask anyone what their favorite kind of RNG is, they'd probably be looking at you as if you just asked them about their favorite way of getting tortured. Well, for those of you who don't know, the term RNG stands for Random Number Generator. To put it simply, it is how many video games handle random events, such as the probability of getting a certain item, or how likely a certain NPC will perform certain actions, and most importantly, how you can never seem to hit the aliens in XCOM. Over the years, randomness in video games have earned quite a bit of a bad reputation, causing serious frustrations among gamers. However, one might ask the question, if it is so bad, then why is it in almost every video game ever? Well, maybe not every single video game out there, but a possible answer would be that it is used to amplify our excitement when the randomness did roll in our favor. Compared to a guaranteed drop, an item that only has a small chance of dropping after each boss kill does make the player anticipate the moment when the boss is finally defeated. And when the desired item is finally obtained, the excitement felt will be multiplied because of the building up of anticipation. But there are always two sides to a coin. See, if a player did not receive what they desired for hours on end, and the anticipation build up would only serve to amplify their disappointment and eventually turn into frustration. Many game developers have tried over the years to implement randomness into their game with much care and consideration, in order to keep the excitement flowing while minimizing the agony. Here are 5 games where RNG is being handled with much finesse, but we'll start the list with 2 games that did not. Terraria is a game that is often wrongly being referred to as the 2D Minecraft. Nonetheless, mining is indeed one of its most important gameplay elements. So in Terraria, the natural progression of a player is something along the lines of using a lower tier pickaxe to mine a higher tier ore, then making a higher tier pickaxe to mine even higher tier ores, rinse and repeat while upgrading your gears along the way. But the game has a pickaxe called a Reaver shard. This pickaxe or shard, or whatever you want to call it, is obtainable at the very start of the game, and is capable of letting the player skip a lot of the early game mining and upgrading, all the way to the mid-game. However, the problem with this pickaxe isn't the ability to let the player skip progression, but rather the way it is acquired. You see, this pickaxe is obtainable by chance whenever the player goes fishing with high enough fishing power. This means that any Tom, Dick and Harry could have gotten it very early on, as long as they are very lucky during their fishing trips. Locking a powerful item behind pure RNG just isn't interesting, because the only thing standing between you and the item is luck. I think the developers must have realized the error of their ways. That is why they nerfed the Reaver Shark to oblivion, so that no one will ever want to get it anymore, erasing any evidence of it ever existing. But that's just a theory. No, not that kind of theory. Being a JRPG that features many job classes, Final Fantasy XII, the Zodiac Age, offers the player a lot of choices when it comes to weapons and armors. One of the most powerful and most difficult to obtain weapons in the game is called Seitengrat. Saying that this bow is powerful is an understatement, because for comparison, the Zodiac Spear, which was the most powerful weapon in the original game, has an attack power of 150. This bow, however, has an attack power of 224, so yeah, it is very overpowered. So then, what is the difficulty of obtaining this weapon, you might ask? Well, this weapon has a 5% chance of appearing in a chest that spawns only 1% of the time every time you ride the Sky Ferry. So it is a 0.01% chance of getting the weapon, right? Well, not exactly, because you also need to be wearing the diamond armlet when opening the chest, otherwise the weapon will never appear in the chest.
But wait! There's more!
The chest itself is invisible. Okay, I get it that this is supposed to be an Easter egg of sorts by the game's director, but we're not really going to talk about that in this video. But hiding the weapon behind multiple layers of RNG doesn't really make it more interesting. It only serves to frustrate the players who really wanted to get it. Also, for a weapon that's supposed to be the most powerful weapon in the game, it would be fair to think that it would also look very cool as well. But no, the developer had to make it look like you're using John Cena as a weapon. Now that we got the bad examples out of the way, let's talk about the good ones, the tasteful ones, the ones that you want to give them the chef's kiss. And what better way to start off than another weapon from Terraria? Yeah, I'm sorry, I've just been playing a lot of Terraria recently. For those of you who are familiar with Terraria, you know that wings are an essential accessory in the game. One of the best wings obtainable in the game is the Fishron wings, a set of wings that lets you skip a lot of wing progression in the game. Much like the Reaver shark, this wing lets you skip almost to the very endgame tier of wings. The cool thing about this wing is that even though it is one of the best pair of wings, it can be obtained very early on in the game, as soon as your world enters hard mode, or somewhere after mid-game. However, the challenge here is that you have to beat one of the hardest bosses in the game, Duke Fishron, and if you're aiming to get it as early as possible, you'll be challenging it under gear and rely very heavily on your own skills, but it is definitely doable. However, one might argue that both the Reaver shark and the Fishron wings acquisition are RNG dependent. Why am I treating them differently? Well, first of all, how dare you question me? Secondly, it is a very good question, but I would counter-argue that the RNG behind obtaining the Reaver shark serves no actual purpose in terms of challenging the player, while the drop rate of the Fishron wings acts as a check to see if the player is truly capable of beating such a beast, and not just by some happy little accidents. Therefore, every time you use that pair of wings to fly, it feels like the game is giving you a pat on the back, because you've defeated one of the most difficult bosses in the game, multiple times probably. That wing feels so much more well earned than some shark that you fished up just by chance. In my first ever video, I talked a lot about the randomness in Hades and some other roguelites. In my opinion, most roguelites employ RNG in pretty meaningful ways, but I can't stick a whole genre into this list, so I picked a specific case in FTL for this example. FTL, or Faster Than Light, is a turn-based roguelite that features a lot of spaceship models to choose from. However, most spaceships need to be unlocked, and when the game was first released, ships can only be unlocked by choosing the correct dialogue options or performing certain actions during specific random events. Some events even require you to meet certain conditions before it can even be triggered. If you did not read up the wiki beforehand, it's safe to say that unlocking ships used to be quite difficult and luck dependent. However, a few years later, a major update was released for the game. Among many changes and features added into the game was an alternative method for unlocking each ship. These alternative methods require the player to beat the game with one of the ships to unlock the very next one in the hangar. Arguably, introducing a surefire way to unlock the ship does seem to take away the meaning behind the ship unlocking events. But it is no doubt a welcoming addition to those who do not want to depend on multiple random events, choices, and conditions lining up just to unlock a ship. The introduction of the alternative methods also incentivizes the player to try out and master new ships, effectively extending the longevity of the game, not by RNG, but by encouraging the players to play and learn more about the game instead. The Borderlands series is famous for a few things. 1. Having a really fun gameplay with loads of side quests. 2. Having some very wacky characters, like really wacky characters.
You miss it! I want you to blow up the ocean!
And 3. Having lots and lots of loot to farm for. The developers made sure that even your grandma knows about it, by emphasizing it in all their trailers. But the problem with having so many guns and other equipment in the game is that it would be a nightmare if each item was dropped randomly from any and all enemies in the game. To address this problem, the developers assigned a dedicated drop to most enemies, meaning that if you wanted a specific gun, you wouldn't need to run around killing anything that moves for hours on end, without the slightest hint as to whether or not you'll get what you wanted. And most importantly, you do not need to be interacting with other players by trading, and that's always a plus in my book. Most games that featured any amount of combat in them would probably feature critical strikes. This is a mechanic where each successful hit by the player has a small chance of doubling or even tripling their damage output. Critical strikes are usually implemented so that players would have alternative ways to amp up their damage, instead of always relying on stacking more and more damage numbers to their character, because this could get dull and uninteresting very quickly. However, this could also spawn unfair situations where players get really lucky and deal multiple critical hits at the most critical moments, turning the tide of the battle through sheer luck. Being a competitive game, Dota 2 tried to mitigate this effect by implementing what's called a pseudo-random distribution to most of the skill that relies on chanced activation. But what is this mumbo-jumbo exactly? Well, to explain it simply, normally if a critical strike is said to have a 15% chance of occurring on each attack, that means on each attack, there is a 3 in 20 chance that it is going to be a critical strike. However, if pseudo-random distribution is applied, the chance of a critical hit starts off lower than the listed 15% chance, and for each attack that wasn't a critical strike, the chance increases little by little until a crit finally happens. Then the chance gets resetted and the process starts over again. So in the long run, when averaged out, you would still be doing critical strikes about 15% of the time. At first glance, this might seem to be unnecessarily complicated, but this way of manipulating RNG is to make situations where multiple critical strikes happening back to back becomes less frequent. But this mechanic can also be abused by a player by storing high crit chances before confronting the opposing team. But that's a story for another video. As a proper send-off to Monster Hunter World and Iceborne, the developer added the legendary black dragon, Fatalis, for players to hunt and craft epic gears out of it. One of the most essential pieces of material needed to craft each of the 14 weapons is the Fatalis Evil Eye, and it normally only drops 7% of the time for each defeat of this awesome and very difficult monster. However, the game rewards skilled players by guaranteeing that they obtain an Evil Eye as a quest reward if they manage to break the dragon's head twice. It is no simple task, mind you, especially when the dragon's head is out of the melee range half the time, so it takes careful maneuvering around the dragon and a good amount of teamwork to not only bring this beast down, but also to break its head twice in the process. However, adding this simple mechanic that rewards the player who went the extra mile to overcome the additional challenge makes defeating this final boss so much more satisfying and worthwhile. This shows that the developers had put much care and consideration into designing the entire final battle, from the monster's AI down to its very loot drop, challenging and rewarding the player where necessary, while making sure that RNG did not get in the way of enjoyment and satisfaction. So, these are 5 times RNG was tastefully implemented into a game, and 2 times that didn't. Do you agree with this list? If you think that I've missed out any games that should be on this list, leave them in the comments down below. And see ya!